This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Today I'm going to show you how I made these cheap, easy to build dungeon tiles. These each cost me about 50 cents to make with no complex tools, no special materials, and no airbrush required. I've been getting back into Dungeons & Dragons after a long time away this year, and I have been watching a ton of Wylock's Armory as well as Black Magic Craft, two channels I recommend you go and check out to get myself back in the mood for dungeon crafting. So taking a lot of inspiration from both of their various methods, I decided to make a set of dungeon tiles of my very own. I was trying to decide between a 1-inch grid and a 1.5-inch grid when I stumbled across this extremely useful product on Amazon. This product is just a set of 3-inch square wooden tiles, and this entire package cost me about $25 Canadian, or about 30 cents per tile. So this one product solved two different problems for me. Number one, how to make a bunch of square tiles with minimal effort, and number two, what should be the basic unit of my modular tile system, the answer being 3-inch tiles. The next step was deciding how to add texture to these tiles. In the end, I ended up going with this stuff. Plain, cheap dollar store foam core. This is not the fancy stuff from Dollar Tree that you may have heard about if you're part of the dungeon crafting community, but that's okay because for this method, I want this to be accessible to everyone, so we're actually going to work with the paper covering over the foam. And the way that I did this is that I used plain white glue to glue the tiles to the foam core in the arrangements that I wanted. So for the 10 by 10 tiles, I just glued down a single tile, but I also made some longer hallways and rooms where I glued down several tiles next to each other on the foam board. And while this was drying, I stacked them on top of one another, laid an extra sheet of foam on top of it, and just covered it in some books to help everything dry nice and flat. In the morning, I removed the books and started cutting out my tiles. Now, a lot of crafters will recommend you use a cutting mat for this, and I would probably recommend you get a cutting mat, but for this method, you actually don't need one. What I did was that I roughly cut out each tile from the others using my X-Acto knife, and then once I had a big pile of them, I sat down and carved away the excess foam from around the wooden squares, making sure to switch out my blade often when it started to get dull or it started to pull on the grain of the styrofoam. I tend to go through X-Acto blades really quickly as they are like $10 for 1,000 blades on Amazon. And by the way, all of the links to the products I've described in this video, like the blades or the little wooden tiles, are linked down in the description, and all of those links are Amazon affiliate links, meaning that if you click on those links and buy something, I will get a cut of whatever you purchase. So, disclaimer complete. While you're cutting these out, don't worry about being too precious about getting a perfect cut, as we're going to be texturing this stuff later and there is lots of time for cleanup. Once we have all of our tiles cut out, the next step is going to be adding texture to the foam. I want these to look like stonework, so the first step for me was just to draw on my 1.5-inch grid, and once the grid has been laid down, the next step is to draw in our individual bricks or flagstones. For this, you could add as many bricks as you want in whatever pattern you want. Just keep in mind, the more bricks you add to each tile, the more work it's going to be later. For actually creating the texture, I just used my X-Acto knife and first cut into the grid down the middle of the tile at a 45-degree angle on one side. I followed this up by mirroring this cut on the other side at another 45-degree angle. This should result in something that looks like this. It is sort of like a V cut, and you can then do this to the other two remaining grid lines as well. After this, it's just a matter of cutting out the negative space between all of your other bricks using the same method, carving the foam at that 45-degree angle, and then carving in again on one or two opposite sides to make the bricks pop out of the ground. Once again, you really want to make sure you're using a sharp blade for this, so after a tile or two, you probably want to swap out your blade. But again, these blades are dirt cheap. They're a great investment to buy a box of like 1,000 of them. Much like today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website creation platform that I've been using for over a decade now to suit all of my website needs. And much like making these dungeon tiles, everything with Squarespace is extremely affordable, easy to use, and set up to work in an extremely modular way. You just pick a template that looks good to you, drag and drop more modules in whatever configuration you want, and then customize your pages as little or as much as you like. No coding or technical knowledge required. If you can make these dungeon tiles, you can make a Squarespace website. I've been using my Squarespace site all year to house my reference documents, hobby progress, as well as my new online store full of merch, and I have been extremely happy with the results. So if you'd like to make your own website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to take your website live, go to squarespace.com/DanaHowl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. Back to our tutorial. Once our texture has been cut into the tiles, it's time to seal up our foam with the classic Blackmagic Craft mixture of matte Mod Podge and cheap black paint. If you're unfamiliar with this tactic, Mod Podge is just a sealant. It's sort of like a primer that will seal up your styrofoam so that we can paint on top of it later with water-based paints and not have our styrofoam act like a sponge and soak up all the paint. And the reason we add black paint to this mixture is just so it's a little bit easier to see, but also because I want a black base coat for the tiles. So I did this to as many of the tiles as I had time for, and in some cases I added a second coat if the base coat wasn't as black as I wanted it to be. I let the Mod Podge dry overnight to really let it harden and set, and then in the morning everything will be ready for painting. Once the Mod Podge is dry, you'll also notice that it's given our tiles a slight texture, which will make the painting process so much easier. It's really up to you what color you want to paint your tiles. I tried a ton of different schemes for this. It really depends on what sorts of dungeons you imagine using this most frequently for. For me, my campaign is set in a city on top of a massive mega dungeon, so I went with a red brick color scheme for my set of tiles. If you want a more traditional gray color scheme for your tiles, I would recommend checking out the Wylock video that I've linked down in the description, as I think that color scheme would work really well for these tiles too. I basically learned everything in this video from Wylock, and I've ripped off all of his techniques, so you should really go and check out his channel. To start out, I went with a heavy dry brush over the entire tile with a brick red color. And I just used cheap $1 paints for this from the craft store. You can get these pretty much anywhere. And the goal here is just to get down a base coat on the stones as quickly as we can, while leaving as much black as possible in the recesses of the stones. I did about 2 or 3 coats of this, and I used my brush sort of like a sponge on the final coat, just pressing down directly onto the tile with the brush so that the brush strokes were less visible. A sponge would probably work better for this. And after a few coats, it should look like this. Now, to give the tiles some variation, I'm going to add in a few other colors, starting with this cherry red. And the way I'm going to do this is pretty much the same way as the first color. I just put a little bit of paint on my brush, wipe off the excess on a paper towel, and then softly apply it to the dungeon tile. But in this case, I'm trying to just get the paint on every second or third stone on the tile, not applying it to the whole stone. I just want a bit of variation in tone. Next up, we're going to do this same thing with this warm brown color, just applying it to a few of the rocks in a random way to give the stones some variation. After this, I wanted to give all the stones a bit of a highlight, so I gave the entire tile a quick dry brush with a lighter orange brown color, and I finished up by giving the entire tile a dry brush of a warm off-white color. But rather than using my typical warm off-white color of choice, today I'm actually going to be using a special mix that the paint scientists over at Army Painter made for me as a Christmas gift. So huge thanks to Thomas over at the Army Painter. I really appreciate that you made this for me and sent it to me. I really like it. Of course, those of you who haven't received a special Christmas gift from the Army Painter, you can just use any off-white color you want. And I applied this off-white dry brush to the entire tile, dry brushing it on and just trying to catch the edges of the stones. But of course, I went a little bit too far with this highlight, so after this, I dry brushed on a little bit of that warm brown we just used to take things back to a more muted stone look. And then I finished things up by adding a wash of black paint between the recesses of the stones. I didn't use any kind of fancy black wash for this, although you could if you want to. I just used watered down cheap black acrylic paint and applied it into the recesses. And that's it. that is my recipe for making dungeon tiles for Howl City, my brand new D&D campaign that I'm playing with my friends. Now you might notice that these dungeon tiles don't have walls, and in general I think I'm going to go with the wall-less method that a lot of the cool kids are using right now, where negative space is just implied to be a stone wall. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of cool modular walls, doors, and other accessories I could make for this set of dungeon tiles. So let me know if you want to see more dungeon dressings and dungeon walls and dungeon tiles from me in the future. I know this is kind of a contentious time to be getting into D&D. You can look into the recent D&D news, but I'm regardless very into role-playing games right now. So if that's something you want to see on this channel, definitely let me know. Thank you to our new editor, Annie, for editing this video. Thank you to all of our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/DanaHowell for supporting the making of videos on this channel. And as always, I will see you in the next video.